بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المقتولين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من يوم عداوتهم إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Inshallah ta'ala wa bi'ithnillah, over the next 10 nights, I inshallah intend to take us on a journey in which we acquire knowledge, but not only acquire knowledge, but understand why this knowledge is important. Why is it that we come here? Why is it that we attend these functions? Why is it that we remember Abu Abdullah altogether? So my plan, inshallah, for the next 10 nights, for the first 3 nights, or 2.5 nights at least, we will be looking closely at why we cry for Abu Abdullah. What do these tears mean? Why do we send salam to him? Is it important? Is what we are doing here culture, or is it Islam? Is it something that developed in the Middle East, or is it something which, is it something that developed in the Middle East out of people's tribal culture, or is it something that the Ahlul Bayt told us to do? Right? So we need to understand why it is that we do what we do. Do we do it because we follow our fathers and our fathers and their fathers and their fathers, or do we do it because it is a religious obligation? So we're going to inshallah look at that for the first 2.5 to 3 nights, and then we are going to move on to look at various attributes of Imam al-Hussein, such as the one who fought against the Fasiqeen. We're going to look at the death of Imam al-Hussein. We are going to look at his treatment of orphans. We're going to look at all different attributes of Imam al-Hussein and draw a connection between these attributes, these sifat of Imam al-Hussein and his companions and our life today. So inshallah, I hope we all grow from night 1 to night 10, inshallah. So tonight, what I wanted to discuss is the institution of ziyarah and a'za. The institution of ziyarah, of visiting Imam al-Hussein, and the remembrance of his tragedy. Is this something which was invented later? Is this something which different cultures decided to develop in order to remember him? Or is it something that the Ahlul Bayt told us to remember? Why does this matter? It matters because if it is something which just developed culturally, then that means that it can go away, that it can die, that it can change. That maybe next year, instead of having a masaib, you could just not have any lectures altogether and decide to do just a seminar. Why do we cry? Is it something important or not? And my argument in the next 45 minutes or 40 minutes is that in fact it is a part of the sunnah of Ahlul Bayt and it's a requirement. First, let us look at the passing of Imam al-Hussein and what happened after. What we see from very early on, after the passing of Abu Abdullah, we see an explosion of a literary culture. What do I mean by this? As soon as the Imam died, we see all sorts of companions beginning to write poetry about his life. In fact, this poetry is found in the earliest Sunni books. The earliest poetry of Aza, describing the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein, the death of Imam al-Hussein, why we should grieve over the death of Imam al-Hussein is found in the earliest books of the Ahl Sunnah, written by very early companions who would visit the grave of Imam al-Hussein and they would record poetry at his grave. A major turning point to this was the time of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, who continued to develop this institution of majalis and this institution of mourning for Abu Abdullah. However, furthermore, there were two practices which were tied up together. One, mourning for the death of Imam al-Hussein, mourning over his sacrifice, and the ziyarah itself. According to early accounts, those who visited the grave of Imam al-Hussein at the time of Imam al-Baqir, at least if not earlier, would visit the grave of the Imam, and then when they're at the grave of the Imam, they would do a latmiyah at the grave of Imam al-Hussein from very early period. For example, in some of the earliest poetry, or rather even before that, at the time of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he had a companion by the name of Abu Umara. And the Imam would turn to him and he would tell him, "Wanshudni fil Hussein." Recite for me a poem about Imam al-Hussein. This is Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam telling his companion Abu Umara to recite for him a poem about Imam al-Hussein. Abu Umara says, "Fanshudtuhu fabaka." I recited it and the Imam began to cry. "Fanshudtuhu fabaka." I recited another one and the Imam continued to cry. وَمَا زِلْتُ أَنْشُدُهُ حَتَّى وَيَبْكِي حَتَّى سَمِعْتُ الْبُكَاءَ مِنَ الدَّارِ. He says that, and I continued to recite a poem after a poem after a poem, and I began to hear crying from the house of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. So what we are gathered here for is the sunnah of Ahlul Bayt. The Ahlul Bayt alayhim afdala salatu wassalam would often gather in this way. The Imam would have, there would be a line of people ready to recite various kinds of poetry for Imam al-Hussein or about Imam al-Hussein, about the death of Imam al-Hussein, and then the Imam would begin to cry. And in fact, the Imam goes further to say, he says, وَمَنْ أَنْشَدَ فِي الْحُسَيْنِ شِعْرًا فَأَبْكَى خَمْسِينَ فَلَهُ الْجَنَّةِ. The one, and this is found in the earliest sources, the one who recites a single poem for Imam al-Hussein, or a kind of marthiyah for Imam al-Hussein, and makes 50 people cry, for him is Jannah. The one who recites a poem for Imam al-Hussein and makes 40 people cry, for him is Jannah. And he goes on to say, the one who makes 30 people cry, for him is Jannah. The one who recites a single marthiyah for Abu Abdullah and makes a single person cry, falahu al-Jannah. This institution of marthiyah and the recitation of poetry and the latmiyah is a sacred muqaddas institution. It is not cultural. It is not something invented by certain cultures. It is something that the A'imma themselves instituted during their lifetime and in their homes. And in fact, their homes would, at the time of Muharram, would be converted into a Husayniyah. The people would sit, the poets would arrive, and they would begin to recite for the Imam. So what we are gathered here for is not a bid'ah, it is not an innovation, it is not something new, it is the sunnah and the practice of the Ahlul Bayt. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Imagine, falahu al-Jannah, the one who recites one poem for Imam al-Hussein and makes one person cry, for this person is paradise. Now, through the nights, we're going to talk about how this person can, how we can achieve paradise. What are the conditions attached to these magnificent and sacred traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, which are found in the earliest sources of the tradition, accepted by the great ulama. But we're going to discuss what are the shurut and the conditions for us to qualify in this category, inshallah. But we can never and must never and can never afford to demean or devalue this institution. To devalue this institution is to devalue the ai altogether. To devalue this institution of mourning and sadness and huzn, and especially the recitation of elegies and marthiyah, is as good as rejecting the imam altogether. It is as good as saying I am no longer a Shia of Ahlul Bayt. Because this is among, if not the most powerful symbol of what it means to be a lover and a follower of the A'immah, of the Imams. When the companions of the A'immah would go for ziyarah, by the time of the 5th and the 6th Imam, they would go to the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein. What would they say at the ziyarah? They would say, Marartu ala qabr al-Hussein bi Karbala. For example, Uqbar bin Amr al-Sahmi, he says, I passed by the grave of Hussein at Karbala. فَفَادَ عَلَيْهِ مِن دُمُوعِ غَزِيزًا. And my tears began to gush like a waterfall over the grave of Hussein ibn Ali. They wouldn't even stop, but just by passing by the grave of Hussein, their tears would begin to flow down their cheeks. Ghaziza, pouring out of their face, dripping onto the holy grave of Abu Abdullah in Karbala. This is the time of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. We're talking, this is like 1300 years ago, 1250 years ago. This poetry is found in the earliest books of Arabic poetry. This is not later things. What I'm bringing you here is found in some of the most classical sources of Arabic literature. And some of the greatest forms of Arabic literature was what? The Marathiyah for Abu Abdullah al-Hussein ibn Ali. From then until now. Let's go to another tradition. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam has said, alayhi afdal salatu wassalam, he has said, it's been transmitted from Isa ibn Abi Mansur, who says, Sami'tu Abu Abdullah yaqul. I heard Imam Sadiq say, and this tradition is also found in the Amali of Mufid and Tusi, with a separate chain of transmission for those who are curious about these sorts of things. I don't want to bore you with it, but for those who may want to question, it has 3 different isnads, and they're generally accepted to be authentic. Where the Imam says, نَفَسُ الْمَحْمُومِ لَنَا الْمُخْتَمِّ لِظُلْمِنَا تَصْبِيحٍ. The heart, or the breath, the heartbeat, or the breath, which is concerned for us, is distressed at seeing our oppression, should know that this is a tasbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Their concern and their distress and their sadness at witnessing the dhulm that we have experienced, they should know that every beat of this heart is the tasbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is the glorification and the taqdees of Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. Imagine. وَهَمُّهُ لِأَمْرِنَا عِبَادَةً. And concern for our amr, for our affair, is the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning constantly being concerned whether I am fulfilling what my imam has expected of me or not. Constantly being concerned whether my imam of the time will be happy with me on Thursday night or not, when my a'mal, we believe in a'radul a'mal, when our deeds are brought to the imam of the time on Thursday night, we are constantly worried, how will my imam react? That I've missed my salat, God forbid, how will my imam react? I have not watched my hijab, how will my imam react? I have, yadha billah, committed backbiting, how will my imam react? Or, out of the love of my imam, out of knowing that my deeds will be brought to the imam of my time on Thursday night, I have secured my faith in that week. And this concern is the ibadah of Allah, because concern for the affair of the Imam is the worship of Allah, because it is the A'imma that call us to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Furthermore, the ham that we have for the Imam is such that in these nights we console the Imam of the time. In these nights, the tears that fall from our cheeks are given as a hadiyah to the Imam of our time. They are given as a sign of our bay'ah and our pledge of allegiance to Sahib al-Asri wa Zaman. The tears that fall from our cheeks are given as an offer of bay'ah, of a renewal, of a tajdeed of our bay'ah to the Imam of the time. If our tears and our concern and our grief and our worry and our sadness is for this sake, then it is the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Furthermore, if we want to qualify within this tradition, such that every heartbeat of ours, which beats fast in a state of grief for our Imam, then our family and our life reflects the sadness of our sadness for the Ahlul Bayt. Meaning that when I go home from here, it is not just another day. I don't just turn on the TV and it's not just another day. For me and for my family, the days of Azah have arrived. The days of sadness have arrived. It is not just another day. I don't leave from here, get in my car, go home, and it is just another day. No, these days are different. And I and my family reflect this. This is reflected in our demeanor, in our behavior, in the way we speak to each other, even in the way we dress. And all of this inculcates and implants a profound sense of humility and sobriety in front of God. It puts us in a state of khushu', as the traditions state. That this sort of constant worry and concern implants a sense of khushu' and humility and awe before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let's turn to Imam al-Rida now. Or rather, by the time of Imam al-Kadhim and Imam al-Rida alayhim as-salam, the institution of majalis was just growing and growing and growing. It was becoming more powerful and larger and larger. For example, Imam al-Rida says, with regards to the beginning of the month of Muharram, this is how our Imam would mourn. This is the demeanor of our Imam at the beginning of the month of Muharram. So when we should take some heed to these words. The Imam says, Muharram was a month in the pre-Islamic period in which shedding blood was prohibited. فَاسْتُحِلَتْ فِيهِ دِمَاؤُنَا. But in this month our blood was made lawful to be taken. وَخُتِكَتْ فِيهِ حُرْمَتُنَا. And in this month our sanctity and respect was torn and shred up. وَسُبِّهَ فِيهِ ذَرَارِيرُنَا وَنِسَاؤُنَا. And in this month our children and family were taken prisoner and our women were taken prisoner. Subhanallah, ya Aba Abdullah. The Imam is alluding to how the Ahlul Bayt were treated as slaves, treated as animals, according to Ziyarat al-Nahiya and other reports. Treated as animals were treated. that this dawned upon the Imam when the month of Muharram began. The first of Muharram was not like any other day. They didn't just go on, it was not business as usual. The Imam continues, he says, Inna yawm al-Husayn akraha jufunana. That on the day of Hussein, our eyelids are torn. Meaning they are dripping blood from their eyelids. Their eyelids, akraha, yani it's torn, ulcerated from tears. This is the aimma, this is not the culture. This is Imam al-Rida speaking, found in the earliest sources, Uyun Akhbar Rida of Sheikh al-Saduq. Inna yawm al-Husayn akraha jufunana. Our eyelids are made to tear from the tears that we shed. Subhanallah, Allahu Akbar. Wa asbala dumu'ana. And our tears begin to flow. This is Imam Rida speaking. فَلَّبَّيْكَ الْبَاكُونَ فَلَّبَّيْكَ. The Imam says, our tears begin to flow. And he says, here are your weepers. The Imam is telling the weepers, for those who are crying for Abu Abdullah in this month, that he is with them. لَبَّيْكَ الْبَاكُونَ لَبَّيْكَ الْبَاكُونَ. Imagine. This is not a month like any other month. These are not days like any other days. And then the Imam says, فَإِنَّ الْبُكَاءَ عَلَيْهِ يُحُطُّ الذُّنُوبَ الْعِظَامِ. That the tears for my grandfather Abu Abdullah erase and encompass even the greatest of sins. Even the greatest of sins are ready to be forgiven for the sake of our tears, for the sake of our sadness in this month. But it is up to us whether we want to take advantage of this or whether we want to go home and it is business as usual. That is for each and every one of us to decide. Meaning that these tears that are shed are supposed to be transformative. They are supposed to inculcate a sense of revolution and profound change in our character, our behavior, and our worship. If these tears are not followed by a sense of change, by a spiritual transformation, then they would have been of no use. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Furthermore, none of this is a culture. It is a manifestation of our commitment and our bay'ah to the ethics of Hussein, the humanity of Hussein, the charity of Hussein, and the courage of Hussein ibn Ali, alayhi afdala salatu wassalam. This is not a culture. This is the deen, as it is. We can take it or we can leave it. The choice is ours. We don't need to be politically correct about this. We don't need to apologize about this. And we don't need to be sorry about this. This is the teachings of the Aimah. Let's look at another poem. Imam al-Rida's poet, Di'b al-Khuza'i, famous poet. Just to give you an idea of the kind of poetry that they would recite in the majlis of the Imam. Many of you would already know this poem, but for many of the young ones, you won't know. You probably have not heard this before. I want us to appreciate what it means to get together to mourn for Imam al-Hussein. Listen to this poem. Di'b al-Khuza'i enters into the presence of Imam al-Rida. He looks at Imam al-Rida and he says, "O Imam, I have prepared a new poem, one that no one has heard before. Do you give me permission to recite? Do you give me permission to recite this poem?" The Imam says, "Tafaddal, Go ahead. He says, أفاطمة لو خلت الحسين مجدلا وقد ماتت عطشانا بشط فراتي. He says, Oh Fatima, had you seen your Hussein laying down, dead while thirsty at the edge of the Furat. Can you imagine this poetry? Imam Rida is sitting there, the ashab are all around him. Just like this, very similar to this. Perhaps there wasn't a member, the Imam was sitting on the ground. His ashab were all around him. Very much in a very similar setting like this. إذا لطمت الخدة فاطمة عنده. Oh Fatima, when you hit your cheek as you stand by the body of your son, وأجريت دمع العين في الوجنات, and your tears begin to drip over your holy cheeks, Ya Zahra. Can you imagine? This is the kind of words that Imam al-Rida would listen to. Da'bal finishes the poem. He finishes reciting. Imam al-Rida immediately stands up. He goes to his home and he sends with his servant a cloth, and within it was 600 dinar. This is a lot of money. Da'bal tells the Imam, I didn't do it, or tells the khadim of the Imam, the servant of the Imam, I didn't do it with this intention. Please don't pay me for it. I didn't come to you to recite this poem, to recite this marthiyah with this niyat. So then he tells the servant, but if you insist, can you give me the jubbah of my Imam? If you insist on giving me a hadiyah, on giving me a gift, this is Da'bal speaking to the servant of Imam al-Rida. If you insist on giving me a gift, then I will take the jubbah of the Imam of my time. This is all Da'bal wanted, so he could make a salat in the jubbah of the Imam of his time. Imagine. The jubbah is something like what I'm wearing here. The servant goes back to the Imam sends the jubbah and puts the 600 dinar in the pocket of the jubbah and sends it back to Da'bal. This is how the A'imma valued the mourning for Imam al-Hussein. Not only that, the creative literature which was composed to remember the Imam. And that's why I encourage each and every one of you young people here. Compose something. Write something. Be creative. Write it in whatever language you want. If you truly want to participate in the azah of the Imam of our time, there is no more better way than composing a poem yourself. Be creative. Think about it and write it. The reward is astronomical. Cannot even begin to describe it. And it will bring about, of course, the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the pleasure of the Imam of the time. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Moving on. As I said at the beginning, or if I didn't make it clear, the mourning for Imam al-Hussein was always tied up with the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein. That is, when you went for ziyarah, when you went to visit the grave of Imam al-Hussein, you also would do latmiyah, so to speak. So it was two things in one. But the ziyarah of Abu Abdullah, I would argue, is the most important part of our mustahabat, du'as and ziyarat and devotions. Why? If you look, just follow me here. Look at every single holy occasion in our calendar. Rajab, Sha'ban, Muharram, Safar, Mi'raj, Ramadan, Sha'ban, I already said Sha'ban, and many, many others. What does each Arafat, the day of Arafat, what does each occasion consist of? What is a common element which connects all of these occasions, Ghadir, on and on and on and on. The ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein. Why? Why the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein on the day of Ghadir? Why the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein on the day of Ma'raj? Why the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein on Laylatul Qadr? Why the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein on other days? I can't think of all of them in my mind, but you know. Because this is one of the greatest signs of the status of Abu Abdullah, Hussein ibn Ali. That his remembrance and his musibah is to be remembered in the good times and the tough times. Why on the day of Eid? The most important element of that is what? It's the ziyarah. On the day of Eid. If you look in the books and you look at the reward of reciting the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein on the day of Eid, you will be astonished. It's remarkable, almost unbelievable. Why? Because Ashura is not only one day. Muharram is not only 1 month. What makes Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam unique is that he is to be with us on every single special occasion. This is the divine plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No one can deny this. And we understand these things not based on the sunnah of the ulama, not based on the practices of the ulama. We understand this based on the akhwal and the sayings of the imams themselves. This is a very important point to remember here. This is not based on the sunnah and the urf of the ulama. This is based on the authentic traditions from the ai which have been preserved from the time of the ghaibah. It is up to us whether we want to partake in it or not. But for those who have doubts or who have questions, this is a response for them. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. In the earliest traditions, we know that the signs of a believer are 5. I won't go through all the a'lam al-mu'min. But amongst them is what? What? Who knows here? Amongst those 5 signs is what? Ziyarat arba'in. Ahsantum. Why? A sign of a believer. And the tradition says whether you recite it from far or abroad, it reaches our grandfather. So when we end our gatherings with the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein, this is a sacred institution, not a cultural practice. It's not a cultural practice. This is the deen. If we want to be Shia, we want to say we're mutadayyin, that we're following the deen, then the ziyarah has to be a part of it. Khalas. It's almost like the cherry on the cake. It's the crowning jewel of the event. The poetry and the ziyarah is the crowning jewel. Not even the muhadara. You don't want to come to the lecture, don't come. But the most important part is the ziyarah and the masa'ib of Abu Abdullah, remembering the musibah. This has the greatest thawab. And we're going to go, inshallah, through the conditions, though, of how we can qualify for this, how we can include ourselves in this category, inshallah, bi'ithnillah. Because there are many heavy duty shurut which are attached to this, conditions. And it's our duty to know these conditions so we do not take this institution for granted. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I'll end with a couple of traditions on the importance of ziyarah, and then we'll continue, inshallah, the subject tomorrow night. The first tradition is from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. This is found in the early books of Sheikh al-Mufid. Why is this important? Because after you hear this, probably 9 or 10 of you are going to come and ask me for the source. Because the content is astoundingly impactful. Listen to this. What does the Imam say? He says, لو أن أحدكم حج دحره ثم لم يزر الحسين. That if any of you perform Hajj in your life and then do not visit my grandfather Hussein ibn Ali, that is, of course, if you have the ability to do so, لَكَانَ تَارِكًا حَقًّا مِنْ حُقُوقِ اللَّهِ. The person should know that they have abandoned the hukuk of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That the ziyarah of my grandfather Hussein is the haqq of Allah. Imagine, the haqq of Allah. It is the right of Allah on His ibad, on His servants. وَحُقُوقِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. And this person has abandoned the hukuk of Rasulullah. لِأَنَّ حَقُّ الْحُسَيْنِ. Because the right of Hussein, لأن حق الحسين فريدة لأن حق الحسين فريدة من الله واجبة على كل مسلم. Because the right of Hussein ibn Ali is an obligation which is wajib on every Muslim. This is in Mufid's Mughni'a, in the earliest sources from the Ghaibah of Sheikh al-Mufid, the greatest faqih. This tradition is found where? In his Risala Amaliyah. He had a whole section on ziyarah in the Risala Amaliyah. I'm not saying that the current Maraja have this ruling. I'm talking about Sheikh al-Mufid. واجبة على كل مسلم. Another tradition from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam. This is found in the book Tahdhib of Sheikh al-Tusi and many other books, completely authenticated by all the mujtahideen. They agree to this tradition. Where Imam al-Baqir says that the visiting Imam al-Hussein extends one's life, it blocks misfortune, yani bala, wa itanuhu muftarad. Because attending it is an obligation. على كل مؤمن يقر له بالإمامة من الله. For every believer who affirms that Hussein's imamah was given to him from Allah, his leadership was given to him from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now I should end, and tomorrow we will continue with the fact that this has been understood as being highly recommended. Al-Sunnah al-Mu'akkada, or Sunnah Mu'akkada. It has been understood to be highly, highly, highly recommended, according to the contemporary Maraja. So I'm not saying it's wajib. The contemporary Maraja and ulama consider to be highly, highly recommended, but they agree to the authenticity of most of these traditions. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that through these nights, inshallah, we will increase in our love for the Ahlul Bayt, and we will understand why we do these rituals. What is the point of all of this? What is it meant to achieve? And we will, inshallah, all of us transform our souls, transform our behavior, transform ourselves when we understand who it is that we have come to remember. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.